Today we're going to be looking at the concept of standard deviation and asking what on earth is it and why is it important for us to know. So, whenever you're presenting the mean for some type of data, you should also present the standard deviation, which some people see as its sort of scary stepbrother that they never quite understand. At first, standard deviation can be a bit confusing and even intimidating. So if you're like defeatist Debs, you might even be thinking you'll never understand it. But you'll soon see there's nothing to be scared about. Standard deviation is just a nice way to better understand your data. And once you've mastered standard deviation, you'll go from defeatist Debs to data Debs, queen of all your data. So standard deviation is a measure of the spread of your data. And specifically, it looks at how closely the values in your data fall around the mean. If you have a lower standard deviation, your values will cluster around the mean like they do in that left graph. Whereas if you have a higher standard deviation, the data will be more spread out and not clustered around the mean quite as much. So why is standard deviation important to know? Well, imagine we're surveying 2 different coffee shops and we want to know the average age of those inside. Both of these coffee shops have identical mean ages of customer at just over 20 years old. So if we focus just on the mean, we might be tempted to say both coffee shops had practically identical customers in terms of age. However, look at the standard deviation for age of customers in each coffee shop. We see that for coffee shop A, we have a very low standard deviation, but for coffee shop B, we have a very high standard deviation. The lower standard deviation for coffee shop A suggests the ages of the customers cluster around the mean age of 20, while the higher standard deviation for coffee shop B suggests that the ages of the customer are more spread out. So let's look inside both coffee shops to see what the data really looks like. So when we go inside coffee shop A, we see it's your typical student hipster coffee shop. There's flat whites, you can't find a coffee under £4. And as you can see from the people's ages, they're all close to the mean age of 20. Coffee shop B is very different. It's more your parent-toddler style cafe. And you can see from the ages that they're much more spread out as the higher standard deviation suggested. There's people who fall well above the mean, and there's also people who fall well below the mean. We can see from this example how useful standard deviation is when describing our data. Using only the mean, we would have missed the intricacies of the 2 coffee shops. Standard deviation gives us a fuller picture of the data and allows us to tell a more complete and accurate story. You might still be thinking, well, how is this important to real life? Well, here's an example that will hopefully show you why. Suppose there's been 2 new drugs developed which tackle the common cold. We've already tested how effective they are on thousands of people, and now we want to know which is the best treatment to recommend for patients. Both drugs were given a score for every test patient on how effective they were at treating the signs of common cold. The higher the effectiveness score, the better that drug was at treating the common cold. If we look at the mean effectiveness scores, we can see that on average, drug A is more effective at treating the common cold than drug B. So we might think, therefore, that's obviously the treatment we'd propose. But drug A's higher standard deviation shows the drug had a wider variety of effectiveness, compared to drug B, whose low standard deviation suggests test subjects had a very similar response to the treatment. And so in the world of medicine, where a consistent response from a treatment is incredibly important, you'd much rather choose a drug that had a slightly lower but more reliable effect. We can do another really interesting thing with standard deviation if our data is normally distributed. Now, if you don't know what normal distribution is, or if you haven't already watched our video on normal distribution, then I'd recommend you doing that after you finish this video. If our data is normally distributed, then if we add the standard deviation to the mean, and subtract the standard deviation from the mean, and 68% of the data will fall between these two values. Now, if we add 2 standard deviations to the mean and subtract 2 standard deviations from the mean, then between these two numbers, 95% of our data will be found. Finally, if we add 3 standard deviations to the mean and take away 3 standard deviations from the mean, then between these two values, 99.7% of our data will fall. This can also be a good way to look for outliers. So if a value falls above the mean plus 3 standard deviations or falls below the mean minus 3 standard deviations, then that means it falls outside of 99.7% of your data. Remember that these are only possible if your data is normally distributed. So we've seen that standard deviation is just a great way of measuring the spread of your data and how closely values fall to the mean. And that if your data is normally distributed, we can also estimate the percentage of data that falls within a certain range. That's all, folks, so see you next time.